A cook-off begins with ignition. Propellant charges in tank ammunition are designed to burn rapidly and completely to propel a shell. When they ignite outside the controlled environment of a gun breech, they don't explode in the conventional sense initially. They deflagrate, meaning they burn at extremely high speed, releasing enormous volumes of hot gas almost instantaneously. Inside a sealed steel box, those gases have nowhere to go. Pressure builds in fractions of a second to levels that exceed what the Sherman's hatches, vision ports, and welded seams were designed to contain. And then the high-explosive rounds detonate. Not burn. Detonate. Eyewitness accounts from tankers who survived nearby and watched other Shermans get hit described what happened next in terms that stayed with them for the rest of their lives. The turret, which weighs approximately 1.5 tons, could be blown completely off the hull and land 30 meters away. The hatches would blow open or blow off entirely. Flames would eject from every opening simultaneously. The vehicle that had been a functioning weapon system 20 seconds earlier was now a burning steel container that was still, for several more seconds, cooking off its remaining ammunition in a series of secondary explosions. The average time from penetration to catastrophic ammunition fire in a dry stowage, Sherman, could be under 60 seconds. In many documented cases, it was faster. For the crew, the timeline of survival compressed to almost nothing. A tank commander in the turret, if unhurt and alert, might get a hatch open in 3 to 4 seconds. A driver might get his hatch up in roughly the same time if the hatch mechanism hadn't been jammed by the blast deformation of the hull. But the gunner, the loader, and the bow gunner were in interior positions where exit required either climbing up through the turret, which was now potentially on fire, or through the driver's and bow gunner's hatches, which required those men to exit first. In a crew that was partially or fully incapacitated by spall wounds, this coordination became impossible. Allied tankers developed a bitter vocabulary around this reality. They called the Sherman the Ronson, after the cigarette lighter brand whose slogan was that it lights first time, every time. The British called it the Tommy Cooker. These nicknames were not invented by historians. They were invented by the men who drove and fought inside these vehicles and watched what happened when the 88 found one. The psychological weight of knowing you were operating inside a vehicle with these specific vulnerabilities every day, in country filled with tigers and panthers and long-barreled Panzer IVs, created a particular kind of dread that conventional accounts of tank warfare rarely capture. There were men who refused to close their hatches in combat, accepting the additional danger from artillery fragments and small arms fire because they calculated that the seconds saved getting out were worth the risk. There were crews who developed personal exit drills they practiced obsessively, assigning each man a specific sequence and a specific hatch, so that if a penetration occurred, muscle memory might do what conscious thought under shock and fire might not. There were commanders who rode with the hatch rim pressed against their backs so they could fall backward out of the turret rather than needing to push up against a possibly jammed or blast-distorted hatch ring. None of these adaptations changed the fundamental physics. The 88mm shell penetrating a Sherman at combat range was, in most engagements, a terminal event for the vehicle. What the crew's training and discipline and luck determined was whether it was also a terminal event for them. The wet stowage solution introduced in later production Shermans, where the main ammunition was stored in bins surrounded by a water and antifreeze mixture, did make a measurable difference. British testing showed that wet stowage Shermans were significantly less likely to catastrophically brew up when penetrated because the ammunition was much harder to ignite even when struck by spall. The fire might still start. The vehicle was still lost, but the explosion that threw the turret into a field 30 meters away became far less common. Crews in wet stowage vehicles had more time. Not much more, but enough to matter. What this entire sequence of events reveals, from the moment the 88 leaves the Tiger's barrel to the moment the Sherman's turret ceases to exist, is that armored warfare in World War II was not the clean mechanical contest that maps and after-action reports suggest. Inside those steel hulls, the experience was immediate, physical, total, and almost impossibly violent. The men who climbed into Shermans every morning in the summer and autumn of 1944 knew, with a clarity that required no explanation, what an 88 did to their vehicle. They knew about spall. They knew about cook-off. They knew the numbers. And they got in anyway, closed the hatch, and moved toward the enemy. That is not a small thing. That is not something that statistics or technical diagrams can fully contain. The armor plate failed. The propellant ignited. The turret lifted. But the men, remarkably, unreasonably, and with full knowledge of what they were doing, kept coming. Somewhere in the French countryside, the summer of 1944, a Sherman tank crew of 5 men is moving through a hedgerow line. The driver is watching the narrow road. The loader has a round ready. The gunner is scanning. And then, from somewhere beyond 800 yards, a Tiger opens fire. The 88mm shell travels faster than the speed of sound. The crew inside the Sherman never hears it coming. What happens in the next 3 seconds will determine whether any of them survive, and the answer is far more horrifying than most people realize. Because it isn't just the shell that kills them. It's everything the shell sets in motion inside a sealed metal box that was never designed to survive this kind of impact. To understand what really happens, you first need to understand what an 88mm armor-piercing round actually is, and what it was built to do. The shell fired from a Tiger's main gun weighs around 10 kilograms and leaves the barrel traveling at approximately 773 meters per second. At 800 yards, it has lost very little of that velocity. When it strikes the face of a Sherman's hull armor, which is typically between 51 and 76 millimeters of rolled homogeneous steel, the physics become catastrophic almost instantly. The Sherman's frontal armor was never designed to stop an 88. It was designed to stop lighter anti-tank guns, machine gun fire, artillery fragments. Against an 88 at combat range, the armor doesn't just fail. It fails in a specific and extraordinarily lethal way. The moment the shell contacts the armor plate, it begins to push through. But here's what most people don't visualize. The shell is not cutting a clean hole like a drill. It is forcing the steel to yield, to deform, to crack apart under pressures the metal simply cannot resist. As the penetrator punches through, the inside face of the armor plate does something that defines everything that follows. It spalls. Spalling is the process by which the inner face of a steel plate, when struck with sufficient force from outside, fractures violently and ejects fragments at high velocity into the interior space. Think of it this way. When you strike a stone hard enough, it doesn't just crack where you hit it. The force radiates through the material, and chunks break away from the opposite side. Steel armor behaves the same way. Even before the 88mm shell itself fully penetrates, the pressure wave traveling through the metal causes the interior face to shed fragments, shards, and splinters of steel that are now moving at speeds of several hundred meters per second inside the crew compartment. These spall fragments are not the shell. They are pieces of the Sherman's own armor, turned into weapons by the impact. A Sherman tank crew compartment is roughly the interior volume of a large walk-in closet. 5 men work in this space, surrounded by equipment, ammunition, fuel lines, and electrical systems. When a spall enters this space, it fills it. The fragments don't travel in one direction. They ricochet off the opposite wall, off the gun breech, off the floor plates, off each other. A single penetration event can generate dozens of individual fragments moving in unpredictable directions through a space that offers nowhere to hide. A man seated at the driver's position is approximately 2 meters from where a frontal hull penetration occurs. At those velocities, that distance is meaningless. The crew members closest to the point of penetration typically suffer immediate and catastrophic injuries. Fragment wounds from spall are not like bullet wounds. They are ragged, irregular, high-energy impacts that tear rather than puncture. They sever limbs, they open torsos, they destroy faces. Soldiers who survived penetrations without direct spall hits frequently described the sensation as the entire tank being struck by a hammer simultaneously, followed immediately by a shower of what felt like burning sand or gravel, except that the grains were steel moving at lethal speed. Some men were blinded instantly. Others reported not realizing they had been hit at all until they tried to move. Now, add the shell itself. Because in most engagements, the 88mm round that causes all of this spalling continues moving. It penetrates. It enters the crew compartment still carrying enormous kinetic energy. If it strikes a crew member directly, the result is instant death in the most absolute sense. If it doesn't strike a crew member directly, it may strike the opposite wall and spall that as well, doubling the lethal fragment cloud. Or it may strike the ammunition.